Hello, good people. It is great to be back with you and to finish up Chapter 2 of Ratzinger's Introduction to Christianity. That's right, I've done Chapter 2 in just 2 videos. Yay, me! Haha! I didn't think I was going to be able to get through it that quickly. All right, we're picking up from our conversation last time where he is introducing the creed, and he went into the history of the creed. This is the Apostles' Creed, of course, we're talking about. And he talked about the dialogic form that the Apostles' Creed had when it was first introduced within the church as part of the baptismal rite. Now he's coming back to that, to talking about that dialogue again. And he says that in the formula of the creed, it is the residue of the original dialogue. And it's a do you believe, I do believe, that brings this you and I into a relationship of a we. The dialogue refers to a we believe, but he wants to make it clear that the I of the I believe is not absorbed into the we, but is allotted its place. And he calls this exploration he's doing a look at the anthropological shape of belief. He says it's not the result of lonely meditation in which the I, kind of standing alone, he says, freed from all ties, reflecting alone on the truth, thinks something out for itself. But on the contrary, it is the result of a dialogue, a hearing, receiving, and answering. So he then refers to St. Paul's statement at Romans 10:17, that faith comes from what is heard. And he questions whether we might think of this as being historically contingent and only applying to a particular sociological situation, so that perhaps in another day it would be right to say instead faith comes from reading or from reflection. But he says, no, this statement of St. Paul is not merely reflecting a historical period now past. Rather, this is an abiding structural truth about what happens when we believe. It illuminates the fundamental differences between faith and mere philosophy. Now, some people might not like that little mere he sticks in there, but he does it. He says between faith and mere philosophy. A difference that does not prevent faith in its core from setting the philosophical search for truth in motion again. So he is saying that even though it doesn't begin in philosophical reflection, once it has been heard and responded to with belief, then the philosophical exploration is set in motion again. He goes on to say, one could say epigrammatically that faith does in fact come from hearing, not like philosophy from reflection. Its nature lies in the fact that it is not the thinking out of something that can be thought out, and that at the end of the process is then at my disposal as a result of my thought. On the contrary, it is characteristic of faith that it comes from hearing, that is the reception of something I have not thought out, so that in the last analysis, thinking in the context of faith is always thinking over something previously heard and received. Now, he goes on to begin to talk about something that I think is going to remind you of a lot of the stuff that John Vervaeke has been talking about lately, talking about word, logos, we're going to get into a lot of thoughts in the end of this second chapter that really tie in a lot with what John Vervaeke has been talking about at the end of his series, and also what he has been talking about in his four-way dialogues that he has been having. So here's what he says. In faith, the word takes precedence over the thought, a precedence that differentiates it structurally from the architecture of philosophy. Then he says, in philosophy, thought precedes the word. So I have to think about some stuff in my head, then I have to come up with the words that I'm going to use to communicate the thoughts in my head to another person. He said, the words always remain secondary to the thought, but faith instead is different in that it comes to man from outside, and this very fact is fundamental to it. And he repeats this, he even says, let me repeat. It is not something thought up by myself. It is something said to me which hits me as something that has not been thought out and could not be thought out, and lays an obligation on me. So he has mentioned this hitting. We talked earlier in this exploration of this book about the idea of something confronting, turning and having something confront us, having an apprehension of something that comprehends us, but that we cannot fully comprehend after that first apprehension of it. Then he goes on to say, now having mentioned again this idea of it hitting us or confronting us, he then talks about it as a call. He says that it is a form of a call from outside with a reply to it. So we're going to get into a couple more, at least one more verb here that I want to talk about. But right now we're talking about this idea of being hit by something, confronted with it, and then having it make a demand or lay an obligation on you in the form of a call. So then he says that this is kind of difficult for us with the kind of mentality that we have today, because we really have it in our mind that faith should be something that we are able to think up for ourselves, like a part of our private search for truth. And he says that it isn't that. It isn't that. It consists precisely in being the reception of what cannot be thought out. Now, it's a responsible reception. And I might refer you to a video I did earlier when I was talking about the feminine and receptivity as a mode of agency. So receptivity is not mere passivity. It is responsible. It has an ability to respond, right? But nevertheless, because it has come from outside, he says, it never becomes entirely my own property, all right? Even though the goal must be to make what is received more and more my own. How do I do that? Is it by grasping it somehow and bringing it to myself? He says, no, he says, by handing myself over to it as the greater. Okay, so he now is going to use a particular word, a particular adjective for word. He talks here about the fore-given word. Now, he breaks this apart. It's F-O-R-E-given. The fore-given word. In other words, it's a word that is given beforehand, before I can begin to think about it. It takes precedence over the thought. So it's not the thought that creates its own words, but the given word that points the way to the thinking that understands. This shows that there's quite an elaborated concept of forgiveness within the Christian faith. We tend to think of forgiveness as merely that idea of, well, someone wrongs me and then I forgive them, or we get forgiveness from forgiveness for our sins from God. But he's saying here something a little different, that the whole word upon which faith depends is something that is forgiven. It's a wider idea of the concept of forgiveness. So that's one difference that he's made between philosophy and belief or faith. And he kind of tends to use belief and faith interchangeably as he's going through this. Now then he says there's a second difference from the individualistic structure of philosophical thinking. Philosophy is, by its nature, the work of a solitary individual. The place where a thought is perfected is in the interior of the mind. It only becomes communicable later when it is put into words. While a thought is interior, purely intellectual, the word, that would be the word of faith, unites us with others. It is the way in which intellectual communication takes place, the form in which the mind is, as it were, human, that is, corporeal and social. So in a way, he's defining what it means for something to be human, right? He's saying to be human is to be corporeal in a body, right? And social, united with others. This primacy of the word means that faith is focused on community of mind in quite a different way from philosophical thinking. In philosophy, what comes first is a private search for truth, which secondarily seeks and finds traveling companions. Faith, on the other hand, is first of all a call to community, to unity of mind through the unity of the word. Indeed, its significance is a priori and essentially social one. It aims at establishing, and he's going to say this again, unity of mind through the unity of the word. Only secondarily will it then open the way for each individual's private venture in search of truth. So he's going to come back to this idea of dialogue. He says that in the dialogic structure of faith is brought to light an image of God. Let me say that again. The dialogic structure of faith brings to light an image of God. Man comes to deal with God in coming to deal with his fellow men. The inner structure of faith involves our relationship to God and our fellow man. These two things cannot be separated from each other. And he said the same thing could be formulated from a different point of view by saying that God wishes to approach man only through man. And then he's going to make an interesting observation. He's going to say that religion, religious thought, faith, belief, these things, that they are like other endeavors of human beings. That in the phenomenology of religion, we see a demonstration of the fact that some people are simply more adept at religious thought than others. People have various degrees of endowment, just like they do for music, for art, for philosophy, for mathematics, for various different things that human beings do. Not everyone is equally talented. Then he says that there are some people who are extraordinarily well endowed in the area of religion. He says the mediator or founder, the witness, the prophet, or whatever religious history likes to call such men, who are capable of direct contact with the divine. These are the exception. And then the many, their religious gift is limited more to the receptivity of the experiences that are delivered to them by the communication from the men who are extraordinary. And then he says, we don't like this. It reminds me of Paul VanderKlay saying that God plays favorites and we don't like it. All right? He says, people object. They say, well, you know, if it's God and it's religion, well, everybody should be equal in it. And there should be, he calls it equality of opportunity. And the same certainty should be available to everyone. And he said, this is a misdirection of our attention and of our thinking, because he said the fact that there are different endowments in the sphere of religion means that people have to communicate. That the difference in religious gifts forces men into speaking for and to one another. And then I'll read this little passage here. Ultimately, religion is not to be found along the solitary path of the mystic, but only in the community of proclaiming and hearing. Man's conversation with God and men's conversation with one another are mutually necessary and interdependent. Indeed, perhaps the mystery of God is, from the start, the most compelling challenge, one that can never be carried to a final conclusion, ever issued to man to take up the dialogue that, however much it may be obstructed and disturbed, causes the logos to resound, the real word from which all words proceed and which all words constantly and incoherently attempt to express. Now he's going to go into a little bit of elaboration on this, and it's got Heidegger's fingerprints all over it. He says that there's no real dialogue taking place when men are talking about something. Okay? The real conversation between men comes into its own only when they are trying not to talk about something, but to express themselves and communicate themselves to one another. He says, when this happens, when man brings himself into the conversation, then God too is involved in some way or other. And I love this statement, he says, for he, that is God, has been the real theme of controversy between men since the beginning of their history. So Ratzinger thinks that every time we have an argument or a serious conversation with one another, we're really talking about God. Goes on to say, moreover, only where man brings himself into the conversation does the logos of all being enter along with the logos of human being into the words of human speech. That is why the testimony of God is inaudible, where language is no more than a technique for imparting something, because God does not occur in these logistic calculations. And then he says, why are we having such difficulty today in speaking about God? It's because our language is more and more become pure calculation, a mere means of passing on technical information, less and less a means for our common being to make contact in the logos, a process in which intuitively or deliberately contact is also made with the ground of all things. This is so much like the conversation that Vervaeke has been having, and like the very end of his wonderful series that just finished. And here's another connection with what John Vervaeke's been talking about. Belief as symbol is the next subheading that Ratzinger has here. He says, and he goes into something I mentioned before about what the symbol was. The symbol is originally something that was broken, like a broken piece of pottery or a broken ring or something that then could be fitted together. Then you could gain admittance into a meeting, for example, if you had the right, the other half of the broken piece was there in the group, and you came in and fitted your piece into it, it showed that you belong. So then he says, this was not originally merely a series of doctrinal propositions. The content of the Christian faith has its inalienable place in the context of the profession of faith, with its form of dialogue, assent and renunciation, conversion, about turn of human existence into a new direction of life. Christian doctrine does not exist in the form of discrete propositions, but in the unity of the symbol, right? As the ancient church called the baptismal profession of faith. As a mere arrangement of words, it could be different. I mean, it could be any particular arrangement of words that stated something similar. But precisely in this form of words, it has its own significance, which is uniting people in the community of the confessing word. So he goes on to say that when we come to faith, we're not only turning to God, and it's not in the form of a bunch of propositions, but it is a turn to one another in common glorification of God. Every individual person, every man, holds the symbol of faith as a broken piece that can only find its other half of its brokenness within the community. As he puts it, every man holds the faith only as a symbolon, a symbol, a broken, incomplete piece that can only attain unity and completeness when laid together with the others. So the existence of the church is not some sort of secondary organization or a necessary evil, but it belongs necessarily to the faith, whose significance lies in the interplay of common confession and worship. However, he makes a very interesting multi-level, we talk about, Jonathan Pageau talks about levels of reality, right? And how the patterns go through the different levels. Well, just as we as individuals hold our faith only as this broken piece that gets united within the community, the entire community, the church itself, still holds the faith only as a broken half, which signifies truth only in its endless reference to something beyond itself, to the entirely other, and that's other with a capital O. It is only through the infinitely broken nature of the symbol that faith presses forward as man's continual effort to go beyond himself and reach up to God. So this reminds me of what John Vervaeke says about the moreness, right? The moreness that is there, that incomprehensible more that we are encountering as we encounter God. Now Ratzinger is going to relate a story from out of Augustine's Confessions that is very interesting, especially in this conversation that we're having about the relationship between philosophy and faith. So he says that Augustine relates in his Confessions how it was decisive for him when he learned that the famous philosopher Marius Victorinus had become a Christian. Victorinus had long refused to join the church because he thought that in his philosophy he already had everything that Christians had. All the essentials of Christianity were already there in his philosophy. Like many educated people, both then and now, he saw the church as Platonism for the people, something of which he, as a full-blown Platonist, had no need. That Marius Victorinus nevertheless one day joined the church and turned from Platonist into Christian was an expression of his perception of the fundamental error implicit in that view. The great Platonists had come to understand that a church is something more and something other than an external institutionalization and organization of ideas. He had understood that Christianity is not a system of knowledge, but a way. The believer's we is not a secondary addition for small minds. In a certain sense, it is the matter itself. The community with one's fellow men is a reality that lies on a different plane from that of the mere idea. If Platonism provided an idea of the truth, Christian belief offers truth as a way, and only by becoming a way has it become man's truth. Truth as mere perception, as mere idea, remains bereft of force. It only becomes man's truth as a way that makes a claim upon him that he can and must tread. So remember, earlier we talked about getting confronted with something. We talked about receiving a call, confronted with something that laid an obligation on us, receiving a call. Now we're talking about treading away, right? Treading a way in particular. That would be reminiscent of Christ calling the disciples and saying, "Come, follow me," right? That's the kind of thing that Joseph Ratzinger is talking about here. So I'll read the very last paragraph of chapter 2. Thus, belief embraces as essential parts of itself the profession of faith, the word, and the unity it effects. Let me make that clear. The unity that we have as Christians does not come from us pounding each other over the head into some kind of submission. It comes from the word, all right? It's the word that effects the unity. It embraces entry into the community's worship of God, and so finally, the fellowship we call church. Christian belief is not an idea, but life. It is not mind existing for itself, but incarnation. Mind in the body of history, and it's we. It is not the mysticism of the self-identification of the mind with God, but obedience and service going beyond oneself, freeing the self precisely through being taken into service by something not made or thought out by oneself. The liberation of being taken into service for the whole. So this gives us a sense of Ratzinger's vision of what Christianity is. A way, a life of service to a community that, by giving us this way of life, is the path of self-transcendence and self-transformation. And I think that that ties in a lot with the stuff that John VanderKlay has been talking about and that other people are talking about in this little corner of the internet, I think it is particularly interesting that Joseph Ratzinger says specifically that the Christian faith is not a series of propositions, not a series of propositional beliefs, and that ties in a lot with what John VanderKlay said in his very last couple of videos in his series Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So there's been some question raised as to whether Christianity has really got the resources within it to deal with the meaning crisis. And I think that as we continue to go through this book, you're going to see that there are a lot of resources in Christianity that you may not have been aware were there. The next topic that we take up in this book is the topic of God. God, who is, remember, there in the midst of every true communication that we have with one another. So I hope that you enjoyed this and look forward to seeing you next time when we get into the topic of God. I'll probably be making some videos about a couple of other topics before I get into this next chapter. In the meantime, treat yourself as though you are someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible, so am I, and together we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching.